There are rooms inside the Vatican that have no official name, locked drawers with no catalog entry, files stamped in Latin with warnings never meant to be translated. For centuries, the Catholic Church has spoken publicly of miracles, saints, and salvation, but behind closed doors, it has kept a parallel record, one of fear, silence, and something it cannot fully explain. This isn't about fiction. It isn't about myth. These are records made by priests, handwritten testimonies, sealed audio tapes, and rituals conducted in catacombs, convents, and corners of the world the Church never intended you to see. Most of it remains classified. But enough has slipped through to reveal a system, a quiet structure, dedicated not to proving the devil's existence, but to managing how, when, and where that possibility is allowed to be known. Let's begin reading between the lines of the Vatican's most hidden archive, the Forgotten Office. When the Church created the role of exorcist, in the year 253 AD, the Church was not yet the towering institution it would one day become. It was still under persecution, still scattered in cellars and catacombs, clinging to survival at the edge of a crumbling Roman Empire. But even then, it was organizing itself with a precision that suggests long-term vision. Under the brief papacy of Pope Cornelius, a document known as the Liber Pontificalis noted the creation of a new clerical rank, one that would later vanish from the public eye yet persist quietly through the ages. This new title was Exorcista, or exorcist. It was one of the four minor orders beneath priesthood. The others, lector, acolyte, and porter, were practical. The exorcist's role was different. It was not designed for ceremony or for guiding the congregation. It was, even then, a role set apart. A role for confronting what the Church could not explain but dared not ignore. At first, their duties were modest. They assisted at baptisms, invoked prayers over catechumens, and were tasked with expelling unclean spirits. The term was vague, but its implications were not. The early Christian Church did not yet have the complex theology of demons that it would later develop. Yet even in these early records, there is an understanding that something dark moved through the lives of believers, something that could not be treated by prayer alone, but by confrontation. There are no surviving manuals from the 3rd century outlining how these exorcists operated. Their tools are not clearly described. But fragments of letters, council decrees, and liturgical notes suggest that their work was serious enough to be regulated. By the late 4th century, the Council of Laodicea would declare that no one could perform exorcisms without permission from a bishop. By then, the Church had already realized that this rite was dangerous physically, theologically, and politically. What began as a loosely defined role soon took on structure. The 4th century bishop and theologian Cyril of Jerusalem wrote extensively about the pre-baptismal rites that involved exorcism, describing them as ancient weapons against the enemy. For many converts in the early Church, especially in pagan regions where belief in spirits and curses remained widespread, exorcism was seen not just as a spiritual safeguard, but as a confirmation of the Church's power. The rite became a recruitment tool, a proof of divine authority in a world that had not yet abandoned its older gods. By the time of Augustine in the 5th century, the concept of demonic possession had become integrated into theological debate. Augustine did not dismiss possession. He simply categorized it, placing it within his framework of sin, free will, and divine justice. But even he admitted that the line between madness and spiritual attack was difficult to draw, and that ambiguity would remain, threading itself through centuries of church doctrine, complicating the work of exorcists long after the role was removed from public view. The minor order of exorcist was eventually phased out as part of the wider clerical reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the 20th century. But its disappearance from public liturgical life did not mean it ceased to exist. In fact, the opposite may be true. As the Church grew in global reach, the number of cases it categorized as possible demonic activity increased. But instead of expanding the office publicly, the Vatican chose another route. The rite remained but was moved into secrecy. Only bishops could authorize it, only trained priests could perform it, and only after psychological, medical, and spiritual vetting. The Vatican still requires every diocese to have access to an exorcist, yet very few are publicly named. In 2017, a survey of dioceses in the United States revealed that many had no one officially designated yet still performed the rite when requested. Priests were sent quietly for training, sometimes in Rome, sometimes to specific institutions like the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum. There they learned the 21-page Latin ritual codified in 1614 and the unwritten protocols that went beyond it. This secrecy is not new. In fact, it mirrors the earliest years of the Church, when rites were conducted beneath the streets of Rome in hidden catacombs, far from imperial eyes. The Church has always treated exorcism as a practice too dangerous to expose fully, but too necessary to eliminate. The same tension exists today. The office no longer exists in the clerical hierarchy, but its function persists, woven into the back rooms of dioceses, the schedules of senior clergy, and the private correspondence of bishops. The records of exorcists remain almost entirely inaccessible. Case logs are kept, but rarely shared. When shared, they are anonymized, redacted, or paraphrased. The only first-hand accounts that have emerged do so under pseudonyms or through posthumous memoirs, often heavily filtered by editors and church review boards. And yet the Vatican continues to train, continues to deploy, continues to update its instructions. In 1999, the Church revised the Ritual Romanum for the first time in centuries, modernizing some terms, allowing for translation into local languages, but retaining the core formulas and protections. The changes were quiet. No press release marked the revision. No Vatican conference publicly addressed why it was necessary. But it was clear. The rite was not dead. It was only buried deeper. Even today, bishops are told to treat possession claims with skepticism and discretion, not to dismiss them, but to verify them. This often starts with a referral to a priest. Though unnamed, he still performs duties established over 1,700 years ago. The exorcist's role remains hidden, silent, but active. Baptism by fire. How pagan possession beliefs became Christian doctrine. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the Roman world was already steeped in beliefs about spirits. These weren't yet demons in the Christian sense, but daimons, a term from Greek philosophy, that referred to unseen beings who influenced human life. Some were good, others harmful. They weren't viewed as purely evil but as part of the invisible structure of the cosmos. Across temples and villages, curses, protective amulets, and ritual prayers were used to negotiate with these forces. Spirits could inhabit objects, cause disease, and influence thought. What the later Church would call possession, ancient societies saw as disturbance or imbalance. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it absorbed more than just converts. It inherited a spiritual landscape filled with existing fears and familiar practices. Pagan gods weren't dismissed, they were reframed. In the writings of early church fathers like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, the gods of Rome and Greece were not false because they didn't exist, but because they did and were demons. This was not metaphorical. Justin argued that these spirits had deceived humanity, drawing worship away from the one true God. The Church had no need to deny the power of other spiritual forces. It only needed to reclassify them. Conversion involved more than belief. It required spiritual cleansing. In the 3rd century, exorcism was part of baptismal preparation. Those seeking to enter the Church were not only taught doctrine, they were prayed over, anointed, and sometimes exorcised. The Traditio Apostolica, a 3rd century text attributed to Hippolytus of Rome, outlines pre-baptismal rites that include exorcistic prayers. Converts were expected to renounce Satan, his works, and all his servants. These renunciations weren't symbolic gestures. They reflected a belief that spirits could cling to individuals and had to be driven out before full entry into Christian life. By the 4th century, theologians began to systematize this belief. Origen wrote of spirits that attacked the soul, testing the faithful. Athanasius, in the Life of Antony, detailed the Egyptian monk's encounters with invisible beings who tormented him in the desert. These weren't considered hallucinations. They were evidence of spiritual warfare, viewed as real, physical, and dangerous. Antony's resistance was presented as a model of Christian strength. His victories over demons confirmed his holiness. This framework allowed the Church to reinterpret local traditions. In rural regions where old rituals continued, priests began offering exorcisms where once a village healer or shaman might have intervened. Illnesses previously blamed on spirits were still treated as such, but now with holy water and the sign of the cross instead of herbs or incantations. The theological explanation had changed, but the cultural form remained familiar. By the 5th century, Augustine of Hippo solidified much of the Church's thinking on demonic power. He described demons as fallen angels bent on corrupting humanity. While Augustine acknowledged natural causes for illness and madness, he also warned that some afflictions could be the work of spiritual enemies. Dreams, thoughts, and temptations could all be manipulated. In The City of God, Augustine argued that miracles performed by saints, including exorcisms, were proof of divine authority in the face of demonic presence. The line between the spiritual and physical world remained porous. The Church increasingly emphasized ritual purity. The Council of Laodicea, held in the 4th century, declared that exorcists could only perform rites with episcopal permission. This was not about limiting belief in possession. It was about controlling who could act against it. Authority over spirits became linked to institutional power. Only the Church could decide when a demon was present and who was permitted to confront it. The structure of exorcistic prayers reflected earlier pagan practices in form, if not in theology. Commanding language, invocation of names, protective symbols. The Church used them all. But where a pagan spell might call on Hecate or Hermes, the Christian rite invoked Christ and the saints. The method survived. The meaning was transformed. Demonic possession also began to appear in Christian hagiography. Saints were shown driving out spirits not just as acts of compassion, but as demonstrations of power. These miracles validated the Church's authority. A possessed person served as proof that evil was real. Deliverance served as proof that the Church alone could overcome it. The possessed body became a battleground and a tool. By the early Middle Ages, exorcism was no longer a peripheral practice. It was part of the Church's public identity. Baptism, once a simple initiation, became layered with exorcistic elements. Some catechisms included specific prayers to guard against demonic influence, not just in children, but in daily life. The belief that demons could enter through unclean acts, impure thoughts, or contact with non-Christians became widespread. The rite of exorcism adapted to address these fears. Exorcists were given increasing responsibility. Though still a minor order, their role reflected the Church's growing need to manage spiritual disorder. But the Church was careful to keep the rite controlled. No layperson could perform it. No local custom could override it. And its texts written in Latin were inaccessible to most of the population. The belief in possession had shifted from folk tradition to institutional doctrine. What began as a cultural inheritance was absorbed, renamed, and enshrined. The spirits of the old world were not dismissed. They were placed within a new order, one that kept them alive in doctrine, but bound them in ritual. Not by ending belief in them, but by controlling how and when that belief could be acted upon. Possession in the catacombs. The hidden rituals beneath early churches. In the early centuries of Christianity, long before public cathedrals and official rites, believers gathered underground. Beneath Rome and other ancient cities, carved into soft volcanic rock, were the catacombs' narrow tunnels used to bury the dead. At first, these were simple resting places for martyrs and early converts. But over time, the catacombs became more than burial sites. They became places of initiation, secrecy, and quiet resistance. And in some chambers, they became sites of exorcism. The Roman authorities restricted public Christian worship throughout much of the 3rd century. As persecution intensified, Christians moved beneath the surface. In these low-ceiling tunnels, surrounded by the bones of the faithful, they performed baptisms, prayers, and rites that were too controversial to conduct in public. Among them were prayers of deliverance, early versions of exorcisms, whispered in Latin over the heads of those believed to be afflicted. No official church records from the 3rd century describe exorcisms in the catacombs, but indirect evidence remains. Inscriptions carved into the walls invoke divine protection. Some name specific saints and ask for their intercession against the tempter or the shadow. Others reference healing or freedom from fear. These were not memorials for the dead. They were marks left behind by the living traces of rituals, meant to push back against something unseen. Archaeological studies have uncovered peculiar chambers that raise questions. In the catacomb of Calixtus, researchers found rooms without burial niches, but with burn marks on the stone, and signs of repeated foot traffic. These spaces were too narrow for gatherings and too remote to serve any liturgical purpose. Fragments of broken oil lamps and charred residue were discovered in corners where no fire should have been lit. The layout suggests something else: ritual activity that left few physical traces, but enough to imply repetition and intent. Baptisms in the catacombs sometimes included exorcistic prayers by default. Converts were taught that spirits could cling to them from their former lives. Pre-baptismal rites included renunciations of Satan, his works, and his temptations. These weren't symbolic. They were believed to be effective commands, not metaphors. The presence of martyrs' bones, often placed nearby, was thought to strengthen the power of the ritual. Contact with the sacred dead was seen as a defense against spiritual intrusion. The association between death and exorcism may seem contradictory, but to the early church it made sense. The catacombs were not seen as cursed or frightening. They were considered sanctified ground, protected by the presence of martyrs. If possession was a battle between spiritual forces, then it made sense to conduct that battle in a space already marked by sacrifice. The logic was not medical or psychological. It was theological. To confront evil, one went where holiness had already prevailed. By the 4th century, Christianity was legal, and churches began to rise above ground, but the memory of the catacombs remained strong. Church leaders like Ambrose and Jerome spoke of miracles near martyrs' graves. In some cases, relics were moved from the catacombs to basilicas in the city. These movements were not administrative. They were believed to transfer spiritual power, bringing the presence of saints into new spaces for protection, healing, and spiritual warfare. The silence of the Church on the question of exorcisms in the catacombs is itself notable. Official documents from the early period rarely mention them. But the physical clues, strange graffiti, altered spaces, and localized legends suggest that something was happening just beyond view. Later texts, especially hagiographies, include vague accounts of underground confrontations. Saints reportedly drove out spirits near tombs or received visions while praying among the dead. These stories are framed as exceptional, but they follow patterns that suggest familiarity, not surprise. The Church had reason to avoid direct acknowledgement. During the transition from a persecuted sect to a legal religion, maintaining control over rites became more important. The idea that exorcisms had once been performed in darkness, without oversight, could have undermined the Church's growing authority. As liturgical practices became formalized, exorcisms were pushed into specific formats, assigned to specific roles, and written in Latin out of reach for most believers. The catacombs were gradually abandoned as burial sites. By the 6th century, they were used less frequently, and many entrances were sealed. Yet for centuries, pilgrims continued to visit. Some left behind written prayers, scratched into the walls. A few included references to dreams, visions, or fears of spiritual attack. The Church tolerated these acts but rarely encouraged them. Over time, most of the deeper tunnels were closed off entirely, declared unsafe or unimportant. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists reopened parts of the catacombs. They found layers of activity not easily explained, rooms with no burials, but traces of repeated use, inscriptions half erased, objects placed in niches that served no funerary purpose. Some scholars propose that healing rituals had occurred there. Others mentioned deliverance, but stopped short of calling them exorcisms. The Vatican never issued a formal interpretation. What remains is a landscape of unanswered questions. The tunnels still exist. Some are mapped, others are not. Official tours are limited to safe routes, with frescoes and inscriptions selected for public display. But in the deeper levels, those never-restored chambers remain untouched. The Church acknowledges their presence but does not speculate on their use. No official rites are conducted there today. And yet, for centuries, the faithful return to those underground halls, seeking protection not from death, but from something older, quieter, and unseen. The demon in the Psalter. Medieval manuscripts that were never meant to be read. In monastic libraries across Europe, a peculiar class of manuscripts sits largely undisturbed. Many are catalogued as Psalter's books containing the biblical psalms used in daily monastic prayer. At first glance, they resemble any other devotional book from the Middle Ages. But among them are volumes that contain unlisted pages, annotations written in unfamiliar hands, and symbols not found in any official liturgical guide. These changes are not decorative, they are functional, and their purpose remains only partially understood. One such manuscript was uncovered in 1894 at the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. Bound in calfskin, it followed the standard sequence of psalms until a single page appeared between Psalms 90 and 91. Unlike the rest of the book, this page was written in red ink, in a slightly different style of script. The text was structured like a prayer, but several words did not conform to Latin syntax. Linguists who examined the passage identified a blend of Latin, Aramaic, and phonetic constructs. The final line roughly translated to, "Let the voice be silenced by this ink." No record of this formula exists in authorized church writings. In another manuscript housed at the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, marginal illustrations depict figures kneeling before indistinct shapes, neither fully human nor clearly symbolic. These were drawn not in decorative capitals, but in the margins beside specific psalms. Symbols surrounding them include interlocking circles and slanted crosses. Some resemble protective signs used in early Mediterranean rituals, though no official church interpretation has ever been issued. The Abbey of Monte Cassino holds a psalter containing a side note, written in abbreviated Latin, Salmo ad fugandum daemonum, a psalm for driving away a demon. The page that follows is unusually marked with dots along the margins, possibly indicating a spoken rhythm. A short phrase in coded script follows the psalm, believed to reference a now sealed area of the monastery's old cellar. That section of the building was reportedly closed in the 1602 due to structural concerns. No formal investigation was ever conducted. Other manuscripts include prayers hidden within folded vellum sheets placed between pages. One such example, from northern England, was found inside the Hexham Psalter. The inserted prayer outlined a series of hand gestures and whispered phrases with a note warning, "Do not speak this at the hour of the fourth bell." The warning offered no explanation. No author is listed. These texts were not included in public mass or communal readings. Their use was private. Many are marked with wear in specific locations, creased corners, oil stains, and fingerprint smudges suggesting repeated reference. In one case, a Benedictine monk's personal psalter included names written in a vertical list, next to the word adhuc, meaning still. The significance is unknown. The list was scratched out in ink thick enough to bleed through to the opposite page. In France, a 13th century psalter from a Cistercian house contains initials marked with unusually dense decorative knots. Under ultraviolet light, faded Latin text is visible behind the decoration, possibly earlier annotations that were later covered. One brief phrase reads, "The breath remains," positioned beside Psalm 77. That passage was commonly associated in some regions with the binding of harmful forces. Scholars have noted that these alterations do not appear randomly. They often cluster near psalms traditionally associated with protection or judgment, Psalms 23, 51, 91, and 109. While the Church has never issued an official directive on these insertions, their consistency suggests a shared but undocumented practice among certain clerical groups. Many of these texts are unsigned, but their placement implies use by monks tasked with specific duties. Historical letters from monastic communities occasionally refer to brothers assigned to care for residents experiencing spiritual distress. These monks were not exorcists in the formal sense, but they were responsible for handling unusual behaviors, often in isolation. Their tools were limited. These altered psalters may have served as improvised manuals. A psalter from Croatia, dated to the early 14th century, includes diagrams embedded into the text of Psalm 6. The shapes resemble compass roses with names written at each point: Michael, Raphael, Uriel, and Gabriel. The center bears a phrase translated as, "to bind what cannot be named." The page shows water damage, but the text remains visible under enhanced imaging. No author or scribe is listed. None of these manuscripts appear in public exhibition. Most are kept in restricted sections of university and monastic libraries. They are available to scholars only by appointment, and few have been fully digitized. The Church does not list them as part of its formal liturgical history, yet they are preserved, carefully maintained, stored, and guarded. There is no evidence that these editions were used for mass possession cases or sanctioned exorcisms. Instead, they appear to have been employed at the margins of religious life, by monks responsible for difficult cases, private suffering, or phenomena for which no official rite existed. The materials vary in language and form, but the intent remains consistent: to protect, to suppress, or to resist something not easily named. These psalters were not replicated in later print editions. They were hand-copied, altered, and handed down quietly. Few were meant to leave the monasteries where they were created. Their survival today is likely due to chance rather than intent, but the consistency of their structure, the repetition of obscure prayers, and the deliberate care in their preservation suggests that the monks who made them believed in their necessity, even if they could never explain it publicly. They were not written for study. They were written for use. The nuns who cursed Christ, mass possession at Loudun, and other suppressed cases. In 1632, in the small town of Loudun in western France, a group of Ursuline nuns claimed to be possessed. They said demons tormented them at night, whispered blasphemies, and took control of their bodies. The events would stretch over months and draw attention from church officials, state authorities, and curious onlookers. But as the investigation escalated, so did the stakes. And when it ended, little was left behind except for one man burned alive and a series of unanswered questions. The convent had only been recently founded. The Ursulines were a teaching order, mostly composed of young women from noble families. At first, a few nuns reported nightmares. Then came the voices. They screamed during prayers. They convulsed during Mass. One nun, Sister Jeanne des Anges, claimed that Father Urbain Grandier, a local priest, had bewitched her in her sleep. Soon, the other nuns joined in. They named Grandier as the source of their torment. Grandier was already known for challenging authority. He had written against clerical celibacy, openly mocked the Church's hierarchy, and had made enemies among both clergy and nobility. There were rumors of affairs, political alliances, and secret writings. When the nuns began to accuse him of sorcery, few defended him. The case quickly became a spectacle. Townspeople gathered outside the convent to hear the screams. Reports spread to Paris, and Richelieu, the king's chief minister, took interest. Church-appointed exorcists arrived and began formal rites. Witnesses claimed the nuns spoke Latin fluently, despite never having studied it. They barked, cursed, levitated, and predicted events. They accused not only Grandier, but spirits they claimed accompanied him. As the exorcisms continued, written records were kept, some in Latin, some in local French dialects. These documents describe the rituals in detail, including the specific prayers used, the names of demons identified, and the physical state of the nuns before and after each rite. In 1634, Grandier was arrested, tried, and tortured. The prosecution presented a contract allegedly signed between him and several demons, promising him wealth and pleasure in exchange for their control over the convent. The text was written in reversed Latin, signed with occult symbols. Grandier denied everything. He was found guilty and burned at the stake in August 1634. His screams, some claimed, were drowned out by those coming from inside the convent walls. After his execution, some nuns claimed to be cured. Others continued to report visions. A few were removed from the convent quietly. No further trial followed. The Church never declared the possessions genuine, but it never declared them false. The documents were archived. The matter was not revisited. Loudun was not the only case. 3 years earlier, in 1629, in Aix-en-Provence, Sister Madeleine of the Ursuline convent had reported similar symptoms. Other nuns soon followed. They described being assaulted by invisible hands, speaking unknown languages, and seeing grotesque apparitions. A priest, Father Louis Goffridi, was accused. He was tried, tortured, and executed. After his death, the possessions reportedly ceased. No detailed records were published. Other lesser-known cases occurred in Italy and Germany throughout the 17th century. In 1672, in the Benedictine convent at Unterzell, a nun named Maria Renata Singer was accused of witchcraft after a string of possessions swept through the community. She confessed under pressure, was tried, and executed. Her confession, preserved in fragments, mentions visions, spiritual oppression, and secret books that have never been recovered. The patterns in these cases are difficult to ignore. Young women in enclosed religious spaces. Accusations directed at priests already in conflict with authority. Symptoms that align closely with descriptions of possession in official church manuals, despite being reported before those manuals were published. And each time, after the executions, silence. Scholars have debated the causes. Some describe these episodes as mass hysteria triggered by social isolation, religious repression, or psychological trauma. Others point to the political context, how convenient it was that the accused were already enemies of powerful institutions. But the consistency in language, behavior, and church response suggests more than coincidence. The Vatican has never published an official study of mass possessions in convents. The files that exist, court transcripts, bishops' letters, reports from exorcists, are kept in diocesan archives, many of which are closed to the public. When scholars request access, they are often denied or given redacted versions. The Church's modern position is that possession is rare, carefully documented, and treated with caution. These historical cases are acknowledged only in passing, if at all. Some argue that the problem was not demonic at all, but institutional. The role of women in the Church was strictly limited. Nuns lived in environments of silence, submission, and confinement. Possession may have provided a rare way to express defiance, grief, or despair in a form the Church could interpret without facing its root cause. But that theory does not explain the synchronicity, nor the precise knowledge the afflicted often displayed of Scripture, of exorcism rituals, of ancient languages they were never taught. Today there is no plaque in Loudun marking the place where Grandier died. The convent is gone. The streets that were once filled with crowds remain silent. But the records, though fragmented, still survive in archives, in private collections, in marginal notes left by exorcists who were told not to speak publicly. They tell the story of a time when the boundaries between the sacred and the cursed broke down, when nuns cried out not for help but for release. The Ritual Romanum, the Latin script that locked out the laity. In 1614, under the authority of Pope Paul V, the Catholic Church formally published a collection of standardized rites, titled the Ritual Romanum. It was not the first time the Church had written rules for its rituals, but this publication marked the beginning of something more fixed, more exclusive. Among its contents was a small section barely 21 pages on exorcism. It was written entirely in Latin. It was intended only for priests, and it was never meant to be read by the public. The Ritual Romanum outlined dozens of official functions: baptism, burial, marriage, and the blessing of objects. But hidden within its latter sections was the De Exorcizandis Obsessus, a demonio, or of exorcising those possessed by demons. It was not a theological essay, it was a manual. It listed specific prayers, gestures, responses, and conditions for identifying, confronting, and expelling demonic presence. It emphasized discipline, authority, secrecy. The rite could not be improvised. The priest had to follow the script exactly. No changes were allowed. The text made one thing clear: exorcism was not for everyone. Only priests authorized by their bishop could perform the rite. Even within the clergy, only a select few received that permission. Lay people were to remain distant from the process. They could not witness the ritual. They could not hear the words. The Church's justification was spiritual safety, but the effect was institutional control. knowledge of demonic confrontation would remain behind the veil of the Latin Mass. The rite opens with a direct appeal to the Trinity, followed by the Litany of the Saints, and then a series of invocations and commands. The language is firm, the tone is judicial. The priest does not plead with the demon, he orders it. "I adjure you, unclean spirit," the text reads, "by the judge of the living and the dead, come out." The prayers are repetitive, each one layering upon the last, escalating in force. The structure is not poetic. It is procedural, like reading an indictment aloud. This formulaic approach marked a shift from earlier centuries, when exorcisms varied widely from place to place. In some communities, local priests improvised prayers. Others borrowed from apocryphal texts, or blended folk practices with liturgical actions. By issuing a standard rite, the Church aimed to end those improvisations. But it also eliminated any local knowledge that didn't align with Roman authority. What was left out of the Ritual Romanum is just as significant as what was included. The manual makes no mention of cases involving multiple witnesses. It does not describe symptoms beyond general terms like blasphemy, aversion to holy objects, or speaking unknown languages. It does not contain any accounts of past possessions. There are no warnings about the risks to the exorcist, or any guidance for what to do if the ritual fails. There is no reference to psychiatric evaluation, despite the Church's awareness by that time of mental illness. Over the centuries, priests began keeping their own notes, marginal additions in the margins of their copies. Some wrote down alternate prayers. Others scribbled observations of previous cases, times of day, moon phases, temperature shifts. These annotations were never part of the official rite. They were not collected or shared. They remained in private hands or hidden in diocesan archives. The 1614 edition was never updated until 1952, when minor typographical corrections were made. By then, the world had changed. The Latin Mass was in decline. The Church faced pressure to modernize, but the exorcism rite remained untouched, its language frozen in 17th-century legal Latin, understood by fewer and fewer clergy. When the Vatican II reforms swept through the Church in the 1962, the exorcism rite was not initially revised. It remained in use quietly, while other liturgical texts were rewritten for modern use. In 1999, after decades of internal debate, the Vatican released a new version, De Exorcismis et Supplicationibus Quibusdam. It retained much of the original structure, but added sections acknowledging the need for medical and psychological consultation. It also allowed vernacular translations under strict conditions. The Latin version remained the official text, and the number of priests trained to use it remained limited. Access to the Ritual Romanum was never truly public. The early editions were printed in limited numbers, most distributed only to diocesan authorities. Even today, full versions are difficult to obtain. The Vatican does not sell them. Modern printings are restricted, unauthorized translations are discouraged, and those that exist often omit key phrases or rearrange the order of the ritual. Researchers who study these texts report variations in phrasing between printings. Some copies, preserved in cathedral libraries, contain handwritten pages inserted between the printed leaves. These editions include supplemental prayers, names of demons, and annotations citing church fathers not listed in the original. Some appear to have been added centuries later. Others, written in faded ink, may have been contemporary. No formal explanation exists for these editions. They are not acknowledged in any Vatican directive. When questioned, church officials state that the rite must remain in Latin because it protects its meaning. Translation, they argue, risks distortion. But others suggest a deeper reason, that Latin limits access. That secrecy is maintained not to protect the faithful from harm, but to prevent questions about what the Church claims to understand and what it refuses to say. The Ritual Romanum gave the Church a standardized weapon in its centuries-long struggle against possession. But it also created distance. It placed the ritual beyond the reach of ordinary people, behind locked sacristy doors, behind words most could not translate, behind the quiet approval of bishops who decide not only who may read the rite, but whether it will be used at all. The Inquisition files. Possession as a weapon of control. During the centuries of the Inquisition, demonic possession did not always signify a soul in torment. In many cases, it became a tool used not only to diagnose spiritual affliction, but to justify punishment, silence dissent, and remove political or religious threats. The records that survive from these tribunals are not filled with mysterious symptoms or supernatural struggles. Instead, they show how easily the label of possessed could be used to control. The earliest phases of the Inquisition began in the 12th century, with papal efforts to combat heresy in southern France. But it was in the 15th and 16th centuries, under the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, that the Church formalized its processes. Suspected heretics were brought before religious courts. Accusations ranged from doctrinal errors to witchcraft, and when evidence was thin, claims of possession often surfaced conveniently and with devastating consequences. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Though not officially sanctioned by the Vatican, it quickly became a widely used manual for identifying witches and demons. The book blurred the lines between heresy and possession. Women accused of witchcraft were often said to have been seduced by demons, but if they denied the charge, they were sometimes described instead as being under demonic control. Either way, the result was prosecution. The Inquisition's approach to possession was not theological. It was judicial. A person claiming visions or strange behavior was not first examined by priests trained in discernment, but by inquisitors trained in extracting confessions. Exorcism, when performed, was less a rite of healing and more a test of guilt. If the afflicted responded to the prayers, it confirmed their torment. If they did not, it was taken as defiance. The accused could not win. One case from 1599, recorded in the archives of Toledo, Spain, involved a teenage girl named Isabella de Castillo. Her family claimed she had begun speaking in Latin during the night, describing terrifying visions and screaming in church. Rather than consult local clergy, the family contacted Inquisition authorities. Isabella was arrested, interrogated, and ultimately accused of faking her possession to hide illicit relations. Despite the lack of evidence, she was imprisoned. No records show that she was ever released. In some instances, entire communities were affected. In Sicily in 1633, dozens of villagers reported seeing spectral figures, strange lights, and livestock deaths. A young shepherd named Matteo began preaching against local clergy, claiming divine visions. He was arrested and accused of heretical possession. When others came forward to defend him, they too were charged. 4 were executed. The rest were exiled. The possessions, according to official reports, ceased after the sentences were carried out. The Church rarely acknowledged the political uses of possession, but letters between inquisitors occasionally hint at strategy. 1611 correspondence from a Roman official advised a provincial tribunal to treat the girl's utterances not as evidence of spirits, but as signs of rebellion. Another warned that public exorcisms could encourage dangerous enthusiasm among the laity, and suggested private confinement instead. The accused were not always ordinary people. In 1574, a Spanish noblewoman, Maria Alvarez, began experiencing violent fits and claimed to be plagued by demons. She accused her confessor of abusing her and said the spirits came when she refused his advances. Rather than investigating the priest, the Inquisition declared her delusional and imprisoned her in a convent. The priest remained in his post. Her case was sealed in the archives until the 20th century. Possession during the Inquisition was often indistinguishable from madness, grief, or dissent. But the Church had no psychiatric framework. Any deviation from expected behavior could be interpreted as spiritual corruption. For women especially, the danger was acute. Those who spoke out, defied convent authority, or displayed unexplained physical symptoms were more likely to be labeled possessed. For priests and monks, the accusation was rarer, but when it came, it usually followed political disagreement or personal scandal. Officially, The Inquisition differentiated between possession and heresy. But in practice, the lines were fluid. A possessed person who cooperated with inquisitors might be treated as a victim. One who resisted could quickly be reclassified as a heretic. And in cases where no possession could be confirmed, the accusation itself was often enough to justify punishment. The exorcisms performed during this period were rarely documented in full. Most records focus on confessions, punishments, and verdicts. But fragmentary reports survive. A set of pages found in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid lists 27 possession cases, reviewed between 1,580 and 1,605. Of these, 10 ended in execution. 7 involved women under the age of 20. The rest were sentenced to life in religious confinement. One strange pattern appears in the language of these records. Possessed individuals are often described not as dangerous, but as inconvenient. Their behavior disrupted social order. Their visions contradicted doctrine. Their accusations targeted men of higher rank. And so the remedy was not healing, but removal. The Church no longer defends Inquisition methods. In 2000, Pope John Paul II apologized for errors committed in the service of truth. Yet possession cases remain unstudied. No official Vatican record tracks how many were accused, labeled possessed, or died without exorcism. The Inquisition ended gradually, absorbed into newer control systems. Its legacy persists in the silence surrounding possession trials. Though some files are open, many remain sealed. Inside are stories not of true spiritual warfare, but of power, discipline, and fear masked as ritual, buried in archives still waiting to be fully uncovered. The Archive of Agony. Exorcism records the Vatican refuses to release. Within the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, are collections organized by subject, papal administration, and region. Some sections are open to scholars. Others require direct papal approval. Among the less accessible materials is a series of folders labeled with the Latin phrase de obsessiis, meaning concerning the possessed. These are not theological treatises or doctrinal analyses. They are first-hand records, transcripts, eyewitness testimonies, and according to those who have reviewed them, they contain content that has never been publicly acknowledged by the Church. The existence of these folders first became known through a cataloging list compiled in 1922 by archivist Monsignor Ernesto Piacentini. His handwritten inventory, discovered in a library donation to the Pontifical Gregorian University in 1963, includes a short entry. Folder Group CX2, De Obsessiis, Non Publica Consultatio. The notation Non Publica Consultatio indicates restricted access. No additional notes or descriptions were included. The folders were not listed in subsequent inventories. Documents believed to be part of the same series appeared briefly in the mid-20th century during the Second Vatican Council. In a footnote to a 1965 private communication between two Jesuit advisors, there is mention of a case file deemed too irregular for discussion, marked only with the initials EV, and dated 1884. The case reportedly involved extended possession lasting 13 months and ended with a formal exorcism in southern Italy. No public records of that case exist in diocesan archives. One account, discussed confidentially among Roman clergy in the 1972, described a file in which a Vatican-approved exorcist documented 37 sessions conducted over 6 weeks in Austria in 1892. The possessed subject reportedly spoke in multiple ancient languages, including Akkadian and Koine Greek, despite no prior exposure. The documentation included phonetic transcriptions, reactions from attending clergy, and notations of physical phenomena, some marked as non-explicabile or not explainable. There is no reference to this case in published church documents. Another report, according to archivist notes obtained in 1987 by Father Leon Battista, mentioned a file containing photographs. These images, allegedly captured in 1931, documented a case in Bavaria involving a woman whose injuries appeared spontaneously during prayer sessions. The photos were stored separately in an envelope marked Ocularum Tantum, for eyes only. Requests to view the images were denied. No copies were ever released. Testimonies from a small number of Jesuit scholars, who reviewed portions of the archive, suggest that many of these cases were never investigated beyond the local level. Some priests submitted detailed accounts to Rome, expecting follow-up or guidance. In several instances, the replies were minimal, if any came at all. Instead, the documents were sealed, and the cases were quietly closed. The priests involved were sometimes reassigned without explanation. In 2004, a former archivist who requested anonymity claimed that some De Obsessiis folders contain what he described as post-exorcism deterioration cases, where individuals who underwent formal rites reportedly suffered cognitive or physical regression afterward. The archive included handwritten notations from multiple clergy, stating that the outcomes contradicted expectations. In at least 2 cases, the subjects died shortly after the final session. Autopsies were not performed. Unlike other church files, these documents do not appear to follow a standard template. Some are collections of handwritten letters. Others are full transcripts with timestamps, priest assignments, and marginal notes. A few include inserted prayers, some of which do not correspond with any known liturgical sources. One folder, dated 1911, included a single page of tightly written Latin phrases, all in the imperative mood, possibly indicating a prayer or binding formula. It was signed only with an abbreviation PFA, with no further identification. There is no official acknowledgement that these files exist. The Vatican has not listed them in any public-facing archival index. Scholars who apply for access under relevant academic credentials are told the folders are either unavailable or misfiled. Attempts to appeal the decisions typically result in administrative silence. Those who press further sometimes find their access to other parts of the archive restricted. The Church's rationale for this level of restriction remains unspoken. Publicly, the Vatican acknowledges the existence of exorcism as a ritual practice, and maintains that the rite of exorcism is a part of the Church's long history. But when confronted with questions about specific cases, internal documents, or unexplained phenomena recorded by clergy, officials refer only to the privacy of individuals, or the need to prevent misinterpretation. Among those familiar with the archive, there is quiet speculation about the real reason for the restriction. Some believe the files contain cases where exorcisms failed, or where phenomena could not be aligned with doctrine. Others suggest that the contents might point to contradictions within the Church's official position on spiritual warfare, miracles, or demonic influence. Efforts to release redacted versions of select documents have been raised in internal Vatican discussions, most notably in 1999, when a proposal was drafted by a working group under Cardinal Martini. The proposal argued that a sanitized version of some historical cases could aid in theological understanding and public education. The motion was denied before reaching broader committee review. To this day, no portion of the De Obsessiis folders has been made available to external scholars or religious historians. The only references that persist are scattered, unofficial, and indirect footnotes in old correspondence, whispered recollections, and brief mentions in memoirs written by clergy, whose names are now largely forgotten. The folders remain stored under restricted conditions in a chamber of the archive designated only by a numerical code. No announcement has ever been made regarding their future. Voices Not of This World. The Lost Audio Tapes of 1949. In early 1949, a boy from the suburbs of Washington, D.C., became the center of one of the most unusual cases in American Catholic history. Known under the pseudonym Roland Doe, his reported possession would later inspire the novel and film The Exorcist. But beneath the Hollywood version is a quieter, stranger record one, involving cassette tapes that were made, removed, and never officially recovered. The case began in January of that year. Roland, 13 years old, had recently lost his aunt, a woman who had introduced him to Ouija boards and spiritualism. Soon after her death, he began experiencing phenomena that frightened his Lutheran family: scratching sounds on the walls, objects sliding across floors, furniture overturning without cause. The family turned to their pastor, then eventually to a local Catholic priest. Father E. Albert Hughes, based at St. James Church in Mount Rainier, Maryland, was the first priest to attempt a rite of exorcism. During a session at Georgetown University Hospital, Rowland allegedly broke free of his restraints, pulled a spring from the mattress, and slashed the priest's arm. The exorcism was halted. Hughes never attempted it again. The case was then referred to Father William S. Bowdern, a Jesuit from St. Louis University. Rowland and his mother were sent to St. Louis, where Bowdern had connections and a more secure environment. He was joined by another Jesuit, Father Walter Halloran, who was 26 at the time and just beginning his studies. Over the course of several weeks, the two priests conducted multiple exorcism sessions at various locations, including a private home on Roanoke Drive, and later at the Alexian Brothers Hospital. What makes this case unusual is not only the number of witnesses, family, clergy, hospital staff, but the fact that parts of the exorcism were reportedly recorded. At the time, portable tape recorders were bulky but available. A reel-to-reel device was said to have been brought into the hospital chapel, where some of the sessions were held. The tapes allegedly captured not only the spoken prayers, but Rowland's vocal responses, which included guttural sounds, ancient phrases, and long silences interrupted by sudden shouting. Father Halloran would later confirm that recordings were made. In an interview decades later he said, "There were tapes, yes, but I never heard them again after they left the hospital." He did not specify who removed them. According to later accounts from hospital staff, the tapes were collected by a man in plain clothes who identified himself only as a representative of a Roman office. No official record exists of the Vatican requesting or receiving such material. The Jesuit order has declined to comment. In the early 1972, as William Peter Blatty was writing The Exorcist, he contacted several of the original priests and attempted to locate the tapes. He was told they no longer existed. Some said they had been lost, others said they had been returned to Rome. None provided documentation. Only fragments of the case file remain today. Notes kept by Father Bowdern include dates, times, and physical observations. He described the boy's aversion to sacred objects, words appearing scratched into his skin, and uncontrollable movements during prayer. But the tapes, if they ever existed, are not included in his papers. One curious reference appears in a private letter written by Father Raymond Bishop, another Jesuit who observed the sessions. In it he writes, "The audio disturbed several of us, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. It didn't sound like a boy." That letter, now held in an archive at St. Louis University, is the only surviving mention of the audio's content. In 1995, a retired Alexian Brothers staff member claimed in a local newspaper interview that he had once heard part of a recording. He described the sound as a mix of chanting, growling, and crying, not like anything I'd heard before or since. He declined to be named and died 2 years later. The recording, if it existed, was never located. The last known reference to the tapes comes from a Vatican index of items reviewed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith between 1950 and 1960. A line entry, labeled Sub Rosa Audicio number 509, includes the note, "Washington case unsuitable for duplication." The index does not include a copy of the tape. The number has no known correlating file in the archive. No official denial has been issued about the existence of the recordings. The Church's stance remains that exorcism cases are private, and that any documentation is held only at the discretion of the diocesan authority involved. But in this case, the trail moved beyond local control and into institutional silence. In the decades since, rumors of the tapes have resurfaced in interviews, private letters, and unpublished memoirs. Some claim they were sent to Rome and destroyed. Others suggest they remain in a restricted section of the Vatican archive, labeled but unlisted. A few believe they were copied and now circulate quietly among a limited circle of researchers, though no proof of this has ever emerged. The case of Rowland Doe remains one of the most thoroughly documented exorcism claims of the modern era. Names, dates, and witnesses are all on record. And yet, the one element that could provide independent verification, the recordings themselves, remain missing. Their disappearance is not a simple case of misplacement. The movements of the tapes, the people who handled them, and the silence that followed suggest intentional removal. Whether for protection, secrecy, or disbelief, the decision was made quietly. No formal statement. No public admission. The Jesuit curriculum. How the Vatican quietly trains exorcists today. The modern Catholic Church rarely discusses exorcism in public. Officially, it treats demonic possession as a rare occurrence and recommends psychological evaluation as a first response. Yet despite its outward posture of caution, the Church continues to train exorcists quietly, thoroughly, and without interruption. The training is not broadcast. It does not appear on seminary brochures. But inside select institutions, the curriculum persists. The Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome is one of the few places known to host formal instruction on exorcism. Founded in 1993 and operated by the Legionaries of Christ, the university offers an annual course on exorcism and the prayer of liberation. The program is not open to the public. Admission is limited to bishops, priests, and those with ecclesiastical permission. Attendees are not identified in public records. The sessions are conducted in private lecture halls, with minimal media coverage. The course began in response to increased requests from bishops around the world, who reported a rise in possession claims, but a decline in trained clergy able to respond. According to organizers, the course includes theological foundations, canon law, case studies, and pastoral approaches. But former attendees suggest that what is presented goes beyond abstract instruction. A priest from Argentina who completed the course in 2011 later described being shown videos of alleged possessions, participating in mock exorcism exercises, and receiving access to restricted texts. He was not allowed to take notes. The materials were not distributed. He signed a confidentiality agreement before receiving his certification. One of the core texts used is the Ritual Romanum, particularly the 1999 revision of the Rite of Exorcism. This version, approved by Pope John Paul II, modernized some of the language and structure, but retained the essential components of the 1614 original. The prayers remain in Latin. Priests are advised to use their native language only when delivering supporting prayers. The decision to preserve Latin is not merely traditional. It is seen as protective, limiting misuse by the untrained. In addition to prayer instruction, students receive training in distinguishing psychological conditions from demonic ones. This is presented not as a scientific process, but as a matter of spiritual discernment. Symptoms discussed include knowledge of hidden things, spontaneous aversion to sacred objects, and the ability to speak unknown languages. The course does not claim these signs are definitive. Rather, it urges caution. But in practice, some priests admit that these are the same indicators they use in the field. Several dioceses now send priests annually to Rome for training. The Vatican does not publish how many are certified each year. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is believed to maintain a list of approved exorcists, though this list is not public. In the United States, each bishop is responsible for appointing one priest within their diocese who is trained and authorized to perform exorcisms. Most do not disclose the names. The curriculum also includes instruction on spiritual protection. Priests are warned of potential psychological and spiritual consequences of the rite. They are advised to fast and pray before performing an exorcism. Some are instructed to have a second priest present. In cases where danger is perceived, they are told to contact higher ecclesiastical authorities before proceeding. In private conversations, some exorcists have described additional training not mentioned in the public course outline. One priest in Poland claimed he was taught a series of gestures never included in the published rite, designed to disorient a hostile presence. Another from the Philippines said he was shown an alternate version of the rite used in emergency cases, known only to Vatican officials. These claims are difficult to verify, but their consistency across regions suggests more than improvisation. One of the lesser-known elements of the curriculum involves the use of physical space. Priests are taught to observe how certain locations affect the behavior of the afflicted. In some sessions, a subject might respond more violently in one room than another. The choice of setting becomes part of the diagnosis. In rare cases, rituals are performed outdoors, an echo of early Christian practices. Priests are also advised on how to handle documentation. Written records must be minimal. Audio or video recording is discouraged, unless explicitly approved by the diocese. All records are to be submitted directly to the bishop and not retained. This policy is justified as a matter of privacy, but it also ensures that the Church retains sole control over the data. Despite the secrecy, demand for trained exorcists has increased. In Italy alone, the number of reported possession cases rose from 30,000 in 2010 to over 500,000 annually by 2020, according to unofficial tallies. Most of these are never confirmed, but the number is enough to warrant continuous training. The Church does not advertise this, but it does not deny it either. Clergy involved in exorcism programs rarely speak publicly, and when they do, their words are deliberate and measured. They avoid sensational claims and emphasize the importance of discernment. Yet their quiet actions, training in Rome, studying behind closed doors, and following centuries-old rituals reveal a deep seriousness not always reflected in official statements. The Vatican maintains a cautious stance. Possession is real but rare. Exorcism is sacred yet risky, and only trained priests should perform it. Still, beneath that caution lies a system that has never stopped quietly preparing for encounters with forces it cannot fully understand or explain. Demons in the Vatican. When exorcists themselves reported hauntings, the Vatican is often seen as a place of order, ritual, and spiritual authority. Its corridors are filled with centuries of tradition, its buildings protected by layers of protocol and faith. But even here, in the heart of Catholic power, strange accounts have emerged, accounts not of demons encountered during exorcisms, but of something else. Something that reached beyond the rites and into the private lives of the priests who performed them. Over the last 100 years, at least a dozen ordained exorcists have reported unexplainable disturbances within Vatican City itself. These claims were not made publicly. They were documented in personal journals, private letters, or whispered in confessional settings. And while the Church never acknowledged these reports, several were passed quietly between dioceses, noted as warnings or signs of spiritual vulnerability. In 1935, Father Enrico Pasquale, an exorcist trained in Milan, was summoned to Rome to assist with a difficult case being handled by a bishop's private office. The exorcism took place at a convent outside the city, but after the session concluded, Pasquale returned to his quarters within Vatican walls and began to notice changes. Objects in his room shifted. His door would unlock during the night. He reported hearing the sounds of breathing behind him while he prayed alone in the chapel. He documented these experiences in a series of letters to a colleague in Naples, each more urgent than the last. "I cannot sleep without hearing something move across the tiles," he wrote in one. "And when I rise, I find the crucifix turned upside down. I know what I saw during the rite, but why has it followed me?" Pasquale requested reassignment in early 1936. His letters stopped soon after. In 1952, a young priest from Belgium named Marc Leclerc was studying at the Pontifical Gregorian University. During his third year, he was granted temporary housing in a lesser-used wing of the Vatican, a guest dormitory built over what had once been part of the ancient Leonine Wall. Leclerc had no background in exorcism, but after observing a rite conducted by a senior exorcist for academic purposes, he began to experience strange phenomena. His journals describe sounds of scratching behind the plaster, shadows moving without source, and an overpowering scent of sulfur that would appear and vanish without explanation. One night he wrote, "I woke with the sheets twisted around my body and the name of the possessed boy echoing in my ears. I had not spoken it aloud." Leclerc left the priesthood 3 years later. More recently, in 1984, 2 priests who had served as assistants to the Vatican's chief exorcist reported disturbances inside the Church of St. Anne, located just beyond the Porta Sant'Anna entrance. One claimed to hear a voice speaking Latin phrases backward during Mass. The other reported that during prayer, he saw faces in the flicker of candle flames, faces not his own, and not known to him. No official report was filed. But 2 weeks later, the assistant exorcists were replaced without public explanation. The incident was mentioned in a footnote of a seminary textbook on spiritual fatigue, where it was cited only as an internal disruption due to emotional overstimulation. But those who had been close to the priests knew it was more than that. In 1997, Father Gabriele Amorth, perhaps the most well-known Vatican exorcist of the modern era, gave an interview in which he alluded to strange events occurring in his office. Amorth had performed thousands of exorcisms and spoke candidly about demonic influence. But one remark stood out. There are times, he said, when even Rome is not safe. Evil is clever. It knows where to find us even here. He did not elaborate, but those who worked with him noted that he never conducted exorcisms in the Vatican itself. He insisted on private residences or isolated chapels outside the city-state. He claimed it was a matter of discretion. Others believe it was precaution. One chilling account comes from a security guard stationed near the Vatican museums in 2004. Though not clergy, he filed an internal report describing a disturbance near the Apostolic Palace. At approximately 2 a.m., he heard chanting from a closed chapel that was supposed to be empty. When he opened the door, he found no one inside, but the candles were lit, and a Bible lay open on the altar to a passage from the Gospel of Mark, the account of Jesus casting out a demon. The chapel was locked again. The incident was never publicly addressed. There are also accounts from within the Vatican Library. In 2011, a restoration staff member reportedly found pages from a 17th-century exorcism record tucked inside a completely unrelated manuscript. The page had markings in blood, Latin text in cramped handwriting, and an annotation, non ridetur. It does not laugh. The page was removed, but its presence raised questions. Who had placed it there? And why had it been hidden? The Vatican does not issue press releases about supernatural occurrences. It addresses such matters privately, through canon law and spiritual consultation. But the pattern of sudden reassignments, silent transfers, and vague justifications suggests that even the most sacred spaces are not immune to the experiences their clergy are trained to confront. Not all priests who report such events leave. Some stay, adapt, and grow silent. Others request transfers to remote parishes. A few speak once, then never again. Their stories do not appear in official histories. They are not taught in seminaries. But they continue, passed in private conversation, between those who know the cost of proximity to the very rituals meant to keep evil away, possession, or madness, when science and faith can't agree. The line between demonic possession and mental illness has never been clear. For centuries, the Church and the medical community have approached the same symptoms with vastly different interpretations. One sees spiritual invasion, the other sees neurochemical imbalance, but in many cases, especially the most unsettling ones, neither side is willing to claim certainty. What happens when a patient resists medication, therapy, and logic, yet responds to ritual? What happens when science steps back and the Church steps in? In 1975, a young German woman named Anneliese Michel died after months of exorcisms. Her case remains one of the most publicized intersections of psychiatry and religious ritual. Diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy and depression, Anneliese underwent years of treatment. Her symptoms included hallucinations, withdrawal, and suicidal ideation. But her behavior began to change. She growled, refused food, tore her clothes, and spoke in voices. Her devout Catholic family sought help not from another doctor, but from 2 priests. Between 1975 and her death, Anneliese endured 67 exorcism sessions. Some lasted hours. Audio recordings capture her using multiple voices claiming to speak as Judas, Nero, and even Lucifer himself. Despite medical concern, the priests persisted. She died of starvation at age 23. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide. The court found that Anneliese had died due to medical neglect, but the jury acknowledged her belief and the belief of her parents that she had been possessed. This case forced the Vatican to review its position. In 1999, it issued revised guidelines on exorcism, stating clearly that all possible medical explanations must be exhausted before a rite is performed. But in practice, this boundary remains porous. In countries with limited mental health infrastructure, or in deeply religious communities, the church is often consulted before doctors are. In 1988, in Manila, a 17-year-old girl named Clarissa was brought to a local parish after months of erratic behavior. Her family described convulsions, sudden shifts in mood, and a fear of sacred images. A psychiatrist diagnosed her with schizophrenia and prescribed antipsychotics. She did not improve. After weeks of institutional care, a nurse herself Catholic suggested a priest. The priest, trained by the Vatican, conducted a private evaluation. He reported that she could understand Latin despite never studying it, that she named events from his past no one else knew, that she physically recoiled at holy water, even when it had not been blessed. After receiving ecclesiastical approval, he performed 3 exorcism sessions. By the end of the third, Clarissa appeared calm. Her symptoms diminished. She returned home. The hospital filed no objection. Her case remains unverified, but her family never returned to the psychiatric clinic. This tension between science and faith is not new. In 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum, a manual on witchcraft and possession, warned against trusting physicians, claiming they often failed to recognize the spiritual root of disease. In response, medical treatises from the 16th and 17th centuries began to include sections distinguishing possession from melancholy, hysteria, or epilepsy. But the language was vague, and the categories often overlapped. In the 20th century, psychiatry expanded its understanding of dissociative identity disorder, Tourette's syndrome, and severe anxiety, all conditions that, in previous centuries, might have been labeled demonic. Yet the Church has remained cautious. In 2004, the Vatican hosted a closed symposium on possession and mental illness. Psychiatrists and theologians debated for days. No public transcript was released. One participant, under condition of anonymity, described the conclusion as a respectful impasse. The Church recognizes the possibility of mental illness, but it also acknowledges what it calls preternatural influence, a category for phenomena science cannot yet explain. These include knowledge of hidden information, spontaneous understanding of unknown languages, and physical phenomena such as levitation or unexplainable strength. Most of these claims remain anecdotal, but they continue to be reported. In 2012, in Chicago, a hospital chaplain documented a case involving a teenage boy exhibiting violent outbursts. Doctors diagnosed him with a mood disorder, but when he was transferred to a psychiatric unit, his behavior intensified near religious staff. Crosses went missing. Bibles were found shredded. A security guard later reported seeing the boy rise from his bed without bending his knees. No video evidence was released. The chaplain requested diocesan support. The boy was transferred. The hospital declined to comment. There are also cases where the Church refuses to intervene because the signs do not meet the criteria. A priest in Dublin in 1999 declined to perform a rite on a woman who claimed possession. He referred her to a psychiatrist instead. 3 months later, she took her own life. Her family blamed the Church. The Church cited the guidelines. The psychiatrist said she showed signs of delusional disorder but admitted she believed something was inside her. Whether that was chemical or spiritual, I couldn't say. This uncertainty defines the divide. Science demands evidence. The Church responds to faith. But between the two are people suffering, desperate, and often caught between diagnoses and doctrine. Some Catholic hospitals now employ both psychiatrists and spiritual counselors. They work side by side, rarely in agreement, but united by the recognition that some conditions resist explanation. Some priests refuse to engage with medical authorities at all. Others insist that both disciplines are necessary, that without science, the Church risks mistaking illness for evil. And yet the questions persist. Why do some patients only respond to sacred ritual? Why do symptoms change in the presence of clergy? Why do ancient words provoke reactions that medication cannot? The Church offers no final answer. Nor does medicine. The girls who spoke in tongues. 20th century cases that were buried. Throughout the 20th century, scattered reports emerged from parishes and dioceses around the world, cases involving young girls who displayed signs of possession. These girls were not public figures. Their stories did not reach newspapers or press releases, but in internal church documents, archived letters, and the occasional leaked testimony, their names appear briefly before vanishing again. What connects these cases is not only the age or gender of the afflicted, but the eerie consistency of what followed: ritual, suppression, and silence. In 1928, a rural parish in Avila, Spain, reported disturbances involving a 13-year-old girl named Consuela. Parish records, later discovered in a private collection, describe a girl who had no formal education but began reciting entire passages from the Book of Job in Latin. The priest, Father Miguel, initially believed she was mimicking someone in the household, but when she began speaking in Greek, then in Aramaic, he sought assistance. A regional bishop authorized an evaluation. The file marked "Confidential, no divulgar" was dated the 16th of July, 1928. It included witness testimonies, stating that Consuela's eyes would dilate when the Bible was opened, and that she had begun to refuse food, claiming that the bread was poisoned by saints. After 3 attempted exorcisms, she stopped speaking entirely. 1 month later, she was relocated to a convent near Salamanca. No further records exist under her name. In 1947, a case in Brazil involved a girl named Alzira, aged 10. She had been raised in a village near Recife. A visiting missionary noted her unusual behavior during Mass. She growled when approached by the priest, threw hymnals across the chapel, and struck herself repeatedly. But what drew particular concern was her sudden fluency in Hebrew, a language she had no access to. 2 Jesuits arrived from São Paulo. One wrote a letter to his superior describing the girl as a vessel used by something hostile. The Jesuits conducted multiple sessions over 4 days. A neighbor claimed to have seen smoke coming from the room and heard what he described as a second voice, male and deep. After the priests left, the family was instructed to relocate. Alzira's name was changed on the parish register. No photographs remain. In 1956, in rural Illinois, a 2-year-old girl named Emily was brought to a diocesan office after developing what her parents described as a violent allergy to the sacred. She would not touch her rosary. She screamed when prayers were recited. A local priest attempted to bless her privately but was bitten. Medical evaluations diagnosed her with acute psychosis. But a diocesan official intervened, citing previous cases with similar profiles. Emily was taken to a private residence owned by the church. There, 3 priests rotated shifts for 7 days. Diaries from one of the assistants, preserved in private papers, noted her recitation of obscure papal decrees documents not available to the public. One entry simply reads, "She spoke my name before I entered, and she spoke it backwards." After the 7th day, she was returned home. Within weeks, her family moved away. Her grave has never been located. Another case occurred in 1973 Palermo, Sicily. A girl named Caterina, aged 15, reportedly displayed the stigmata bleeding from the hands and feet alongside uncontrollable vocalizations in multiple dialects. Her confessor initially believed she was faking, but became alarmed after she revealed details from his own confession, which had been made in secret weeks earlier. The local archbishop sent 2 exorcists from Naples. Records of the rite exist in fragmented form, with a red-stamped note reading, "Rito sospeso, osservazione continua." Caterina's body was later found in a well outside the city. No cause of death was published. The church made no statement. Her parish was reassigned, and the confession booth where she had spoken was removed. What binds these cases together is not only their disturbing content, but their erasure. In each instance, documentation was incomplete. Families disappeared, and parishes declined to discuss the events later. Some files, when accessed decades afterward, had pages missing. Others were coded under unrelated headings such as disciplinary transfer or pastoral health. The girls involved were almost always under the age of 16. Most had no history of religious education beyond the basics. Yet they demonstrated behaviors described in older church texts as markers of possession, xenoglosy, sacramental aversion, and identification of concealed information. When questioned, witnesses often reported feelings of dread, disorientation, or a sense that the girl was not present during episodes. In a symposium held at a seminary in Krakow in 1994, a paper was presented titled Adolescent Females and Diabolical Manifestation, a Historical Pattern. Though not made publicly available, excerpts circulated among clergy. The author suggested that young girls were particularly susceptible to spiritual intrusion due to psychological vulnerability, hormonal instability, or divine selection. The Vatican made no official comment, but the paper was quietly shelved after concerns it would draw scrutiny. Many priests involved in exorcisms were later reassigned to administrative roles or remote parishes. Some left the priesthood, while others entered monasteries and took vows of silence. 1. Father Tiberio of Umbria, anonymously interviewed in 1985, said, "You think it is about belief. But once you see a child speak with the mouth of an ancient man, you realize belief has nothing to do with it." The Church never kept official records of these cases. They survive only in fragments, letters, unfiled documents, and memories quietly shared among clergy. There are no statistics, only traces. The girls who spoke in tongues are not publicly honored, but those who witnessed them still remember what they cannot forget or explain. The Demonology Department, a Vatican office that officially doesn't exist. The Vatican lists dozens of official offices under its jurisdiction: congregations, councils, academies, and secretariats. All have clear mandates, staff, and public records. But in internal correspondence from bishops and clergy, references occasionally appear to something not found in any formal directory: a unit responsible for evaluating demonic disturbances at a central level. It is not called the Demonology Department officially. In fact, it is not officially called anything at all. The first traceable reference appears in a 1968 letter from Cardinal Franjo Schopper, then head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The letter, sent to Archbishop Luigi Raimondi in Washington, D.C., referenced a review panel tasked with assessing spiritual anomalies beyond diocesan authority. It directed any reports to be marked DA4 and forwarded to Doma Sanctae Marthae, today the Pope's residence, but then used to house clergy passing through Rome. DA4 does not appear in any Vatican directory. A similar note appears in 1975-inch, a memo circulated among bishops in Spain. It referred to a consulting body under the Sacred Office, the former name for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The subject was a case in Córdoba involving an exorcism that drew media attention. No public announcement was made, but internal notes suggest that someone from Rome was dispatched to quietly review the case. Further mentions appear in handwritten journals kept by clergy. One bishop in Uganda, writing in 1993, recorded a visit by a man calling himself Frater Antonio, who claimed to be from Rome. He requested interviews and church records concerning the death of a young girl during a failed exorcism. After he left, no trace of his clerical status could be found. The bishop noted that the man asked questions consistent with psychological training, but used Latin terminology not typically spoken aloud. Some indirect insight comes from academic programs run through pontifical universities. Between 1982 and 2001, the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross offered an occasional theology course titled De Malis Spiritibus, Administratio et Documentatio of Evil Spirits. Administration and documentation. It was not advertised in syllabi but appeared in internal course logs. Former students recall a course focused on categorizing spiritual disturbances and evaluating when a case warranted Rome's attention. No instructors were officially named. In 2008, a classified Vatican circular marked Sub Secreto was leaked to Italian journalist Marco Ansaldi. It instructed dioceses to send unresolved possession cases involving minors to an entity called POD, Practica Occulta Demonicorum. There is no formal Vatican office by that name. The directive included no physical address, only instructions to send materials through diplomatic channels. The Vatican never commented on the leak. Reports collected from multiple dioceses suggest a pattern of discreet interventions. Priests in Brazil, Poland, and the Philippines reported that after particularly violent or unusual possession cases, Vatican officials arrived without advance notice, reviewed documents, took custody of recordings, and left without issuing formal reports. In most cases, the priest involved was quietly reassigned. Local archives note only personal leave or health-related transfer. Another case involved a course correction letter sent to a parish in Naples in 1987. The priest had conducted several unauthorized exorcisms using prayers not found in the official Ritual Romanum. Months later, he was relocated to a clerical administrative office. His diocese records do not list a disciplinary reason, but a private note from the bishop reads, "Rome has suggested his method is incompatible with preferred containment protocols." In the Vatican archives, some surviving memos discuss the need for centralized data collection on manifestations during exorcisms. A 1991 report attributed to Monsignor Carlo Neri mentions linguistic anomalies, bilingual invocation patterns noted in Quebec and Alsace. These were flagged for further study. No follow-up records have been made public. References to the demonology office continue to appear in private correspondence. A letter dated 2013, recovered from a former seminary rector's files in Chile, described a request from Rome's oversight arm for data on multiple possessions in the Valparaiso region. The letter contained precise formatting instructions for the case reports and cautioned the recipient not to duplicate materials. These communications are marked by a distinctive tone, formal but unsigned. Many arrive without identifying information, often bearing Vatican diplomatic postage and no return address. The language is indirect, offering recommendations rather than commands, but the effect is similar. Priests who receive such letters tend to comply. No one has publicly admitted to working for this alleged department. There are no formal staff listings, no budgetary references, and no Vatican press statements acknowledging its existence. But the frequency with which the same terms appear across continents, decades, and languages, review panel, theological assessment, Rome's recommendation, DA4, and POD, suggest internal consistency. The Church maintains that exorcism remains a local responsibility, guided by official rites and conducted under a bishop's supervision. But the evidence points to another level of scrutiny, one that is neither doctrinal nor purely administrative. It appears to monitor the boundaries of ritual practice, theological deviation, and public exposure. Several retired clergy believe their exorcisms were monitored by Rome. Some received letters questioning their language or requesting transcripts. A former Mexican exorcist was flagged for excessive innovation after using untranslated Syriac phrases and was asked to submit all invocations. He complied, but never received any response from the Vatican. What emerges from these accounts is not the presence of a formal department, but the operation of a quiet structure, a filter through which certain cases pass. Its purpose may be theological, legal, or reputational. Its authority is soft, but unmistakable. It does not appear on paper, but it answers letters. When exorcisms go wrong, Vatican covered deaths and the silence that followed. In theory, the rite of exorcism is meant to restore. It is designed to liberate, to remove what should not be present, and to return the afflicted to peace. But in practice, not all exorcisms end this way. Some end in silence, others in death, and when they do, the Church's response is not always proclamation, but erasure. One of the most well-known and widely documented cases is that of Anneliese Michel in Germany, but she was not alone. In 1991, in the outskirts of Trieste, Italy, a two-year-old woman named Rosa collapsed during the final moments of an unsanctioned exorcism performed in a private apartment. Witnesses described violent thrashing, speaking in low-register voices, and sudden rigidity. The priest who conducted the rite was not officially recognized by the diocese, but had performed dozens of exorcisms in secret. Rosa died from cardiac arrest. Her parents, devout Catholics, refused autopsy. Her name does not appear in any parish death record. The priest was relocated to a monastery in central Spain. In South Korea, 1996, a 4-year-old girl named Yoon-ji died of asphyxiation during an exorcism carried out by a lay prayer group loosely affiliated with a Catholic renewal movement. Her body bore signs of restraint. The group insisted she had been held down for her protection. Medical examiners noted bruising along the wrists and ankles. No formal charges were filed. The diocese issued a single statement. The rite was not authorized by the Church. The room where the exorcism took place was later used as a storage facility. Her family moved away within the year. Closer to the Vatican itself, in 2007, a nun at a Roman convent died under unclear circumstances after a prolonged series of private exorcisms. She had been under the care of an assigned confessor for nearly 6 months. Internal reports describe extreme fasting, behavioral regression, and multiple instances where she allegedly attacked others. The exorcisms were conducted with approval, but quietly. The final session lasted over 9 hours. She collapsed midway through a litany of saints. A brief line in a medical examiner's notes mentions dehydration and exhaustion. The convent issued no public obituary. Her grave is marked only with a number. These cases do not appear in Vatican publications. They are not cited in theological discussions or listed in official statements. But their traces remain in medical records with blacked-out names, in whispered confessions from clergy who were present, and in lawsuits that never reached trial. In 2015, an anonymous former Vatican legal consultant revealed that several settlements had been made over the previous 2 decades, all related to deaths during or shortly after exorcisms. The settlements were classified as pastoral reparations. No admission of fault, no public record. One case involved a French-speaking African nation where 2 girls died within months of each other. Another was said to have taken place in Quebec. None of the priests involved were laicized. Most were reassigned to administrative duties. The issue, as defined by the Church, is one of misuse not of the rite itself, but of its application. Official Vatican guidelines emphasize the necessity of medical and psychological evaluation prior to any exorcism, but these rules are not always followed. In rural regions, or among charismatic movements operating on the fringes of church approval, rites are often improvised, unsanctioned, or fueled by urgency rather than protocol. In one archive letter dated 1983, a bishop in Argentina pleads with Rome for guidance following the death of a 9-year-old boy during a rite that was interrupted by police. The bishop insists the ritual was interrupted before it was completed, blaming external interference for the outcome. The Vatican's reply is brief. "We remind Your Excellency of the necessity of canonical approval for such rites. No further action is required at this time." Among those who have studied these patterns, a chilling theme emerges. The deaths are not denied. They are managed. Through silence, relocation, or bureaucratic obscurity, the Church moves to protect the sanctity of the rite by distancing itself from its consequences. In the early 2002, a theologian working with the Congregation for Divine Worship noted in a private paper that exorcism, though sacred, must remain rare, for its failure is not merely spiritual, it is administrative. The phrase suggests that when an exorcism results in injury or death, the problem lies not in the ritual, but in how it was implemented. The rite, in the eyes of the Church, cannot be wrong, only the human beings around it. And so the cycle continues. Cases are reviewed, not to assess spiritual failure, but to trace procedural error. Forms are amended, files are closed, names are withheld. One Italian journalist, who spent a decade attempting to gather data on exorcism-related deaths, concluded his investigation with only one publishable line. "The deaths happened. The Vatican knows, and it will never let you prove it." These are not cases meant for sainthood or spiritual triumph. They do not end in conversion, healing, or praise. They end in caskets, moved at night, in families told to remain quiet, in priests who return from the ritual not strengthened, but silent. The Church's response is consistent. Where protocol is followed, no blame is assigned. Where protocol is violated, the blame lies not with theology, but with execution. But for those whose loved ones never returned from the rite, the distinction is meaningless. And still, the requests for exorcism increase. The ritual of the nameless. Exorcisms that were performed without the Church's permission. Not every exorcism performed in the modern era has been authorized by the Catholic Church. While the Ritual Romanum outlines strict conditions under which the rite may be used, including diocesan approval and medical consultation, there have always been priests who operated outside that framework. These rites, performed in private homes, monasteries, and sometimes even abandoned buildings, are seldom recorded, rarely acknowledged, and officially condemned. Yet they continue, passed from priest to priest, like a whispered inheritance. One of the most well-circulated examples is the case of Father Luigi V, a parish priest in Campania, during the 1972. He was never officially appointed as an exorcist by his bishop. Nevertheless, he developed a reputation in the region for confronting spiritual disturbances. Parishioners would bring him afflicted relatives late at night. He would lock the church doors, draw heavy curtains, and begin a ritual that bore only partial resemblance to the official Latin text. A former altar boy later described the scene as dimly lit, silent, except for murmured prayers, and sudden outbursts of shouting and voices that did not sound human. There were no witnesses permitted other than a single assistant. The bishop eventually intervened, forbidding him from continuing the rites. Father Luigi complied publicly. But records suggest he continued to perform exorcisms in a neighboring town under a different name. No official censure was issued. He died in 1984. His personal copy of the Ritual Romanum was later found annotated in red ink, with pages missing, and others replaced by handwritten invocations. In Poland, 1992, a young priest known only as Father P was dismissed from seminary after performing an unsanctioned exorcism on a fellow student. The afflicted man had been showing signs of extreme agitation and spiritual distress. Father P used a combination of Latin prayers and Slavic folk rites, including burning herbs and the chanting of names never recognized in Catholic liturgy. According to a fellow student's testimony, the event ended abruptly when the afflicted man lost consciousness and began bleeding from the eyes. There was no follow-up. Father P was quietly sent to a mission parish in Ukraine. The issue is not that these priests rejected church teaching, but that they operated within a theological space that the Vatican could not control. The official rite is designed not only for spiritual confrontation, but for institutional containment. When priests perform exorcisms without oversight, they risk invoking forces they are not trained to confront, or worse, using rituals that originate outside of Catholic doctrine. In the Philippines, a case from 2005 involved a priest who reportedly used a prayer book that predated the Council of Trent. The text, believed to be a local copy of a Spanish-era grimoire, contained instructions for summoning the names of spirits before casting them out. The ritual involved drawing a circle around the afflicted person and chanting alternating verses from Psalms and the Book of Enoch. Witnesses claimed the room shook. The afflicted girl collapsed. The priest was later dismissed from his post. His book was seized by church officials and never returned. There are also cases in which the priests themselves were unaware that their rituals diverged from orthodoxy. In rural Brazil, some clergy were taught exorcism by older priests who had adapted the rite over decades, blending elements of local tradition with church practice. These hybrids often included the use of salt circles, anointing oils with unknown composition, and names of angels or demons not found in canon. When these rites were discovered by visiting bishops or representatives from Rome, the response was typically disciplinary reassignment and the destruction of ritual texts. In many of these instances, no death occurred. No formal accusation of heresy was made, but the reaction was consistent: silence, removal, and revision. The Church does not deny that these events happened. It denies their legitimacy. There is a document circulated within diocesan offices known as De Precautionibus. It outlines the risks of unauthorized spiritual intervention. Among its warnings are these: that untrained clergy may mistake psychological illness for possession, that unauthorized rites may provoke rather than dispel, and that invoking unapproved names can invite contamination. The document is not available to the public. It is intended for internal use only, but it reveals the underlying concern. The Vatican fears not only the act of unauthorized exorcism, but the knowledge that often accompanies it: ancient words, obscure saints, forbidden texts. These elements complicate the Church's narrative, which prefers a controlled structure: bishop, priest, ritual, result. In 2010 Romania, a priest conducted an unauthorized exorcism, chaining a woman to a cross, claiming she was possessed by multiple demons. She died. He insisted he was following instructions from a 19th century bishop, but couldn't produce the document. Arrested, he was condemned by the Church, which called the rite a distortion of sacred practice. Such unauthorized exorcisms persist because some priests believe the official rite has been weakened. They turn to older, riskier rituals they see as more effective. Some of these forbidden rites, labeled ritus antiquus or oraciones contra spiritum, are locked away in restricted Vatican archives. Their presence suggests the Church has not discarded them, only hidden them. Priests who use them often see themselves not as rebels, but as guardians. The Vatican rarely punishes them publicly. Instead, they are quietly reassigned, their names removed from records when needed. These hidden exorcists act in silence, convinced they are protecting the Church from forces they believe the modern rite can no longer hold back. There is no official acknowledgement that the Vatican holds video archives of exorcisms. No public policy governs such recordings. When questioned, Church spokespeople deflect or claim that any such material would be confidential and pastoral. Still, rumors persist. Priests who speak too freely are reminded of their vows, and archivists are rotated out of sensitive posts. Footage is seen, but never shown. The Church does not fear spectacle, it fears the questions. What if someone speaks a lost language? What if a camera captures something beyond theological explanation? These recordings, if they exist, remain hidden not because they lack importance, but because they matter too much. Filmed but never seen, the Vatican's visual recordings of exorcisms. In the dim back room of a Jesuit seminary in southern Italy, an old film canister sits inside a locked drawer. It is unmarked, except for a strip of red cloth tied around the lid. Those who stored it say nothing about its contents, but among certain clergy, its existence is quietly acknowledged. It is said to contain one of the few surviving visual recordings of a Vatican-authorized exorcism, and no one is permitted to view it. Over the last century, a handful of exorcisms have been recorded on film or video. The purpose was not documentation for the public, but private review tools for internal analysis, and in some cases, evidence of anomalies that written reports could not capture. These recordings are almost never admitted into the Vatican's official archive. They are stored off-record, often by the priests who filmed them, sometimes passed quietly from one cleric to another. They are not listed in any catalog. They are not shown to scholars. In 1965, a 16mm film was made during an exorcism in Bavaria, conducted by a visiting Jesuit trained at the Pontifical Gregorian University. The girl involved had exhibited violent seizures, unprompted blasphemy, and resistance to sacred objects. According to an internal report, the film captured several unexplained visual effects: distortion of facial features, rapid pupil dilation in complete darkness, and what was described as impossible contortions of the thorax and limbs. The film was shown once to a panel of clergy, and never again. It was boxed, labeled as sensitive, and relocated. Its current location is unknown. A more recent case occurred in Argentina in 1992, involving a teenage boy from Córdoba who had reportedly become unresponsive to both psychiatric and medical care. A local bishop authorized the rite, and an assistant priest filmed it using a handheld VHS camcorder. The boy is said to have spoken in 3 distinct voices, 2 male and 1 female, alternating in real time. The footage also allegedly recorded a moment where the crucifix on the wall behind him detached without contact. The video was sent to Rome under seal. It has never been returned or referenced publicly. Why are these recordings made? And why are they hidden? According to former exorcists, the primary concern is not scandal but interpretation. Film does not behave like written testimony. It does not filter. It does not explain. It merely shows. And what it shows often resists explanation. One priest, who claimed to have viewed a 1981 recording from Spain, described what he saw as irreconcilable with doctrine. The subject's body became rigid, then violently arched, for more than 15 minutes, without signs of strain or fatigue. Latin phrases were spoken in a dialect that predated classical usage, identified only later by a Vatican linguist. The priest requested psychological counseling afterward. He left the ministry within a year. In 2004, a Vatican advisory board discussed the possibility of reviewing such recordings under controlled conditions to evaluate patterns. The board was dissolved before the review could begin. No formal reason was given. Some fragments of these recordings have surfaced in unexpected places, partial frames, still images, and soundless clips stored in unrelated folders. In one instance, a 2-second loop showing a man convulsing violently was discovered inside a mislabeled envelope marked Archdiocese of Florence, 1977. No accompanying report existed. The footage was quietly destroyed. The Church does not publicly confirm the existence of any video archive related to exorcism. No such department is listed under the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And yet, informal accounts from multiple regions suggest that these films are real and guarded. There is also the matter of viewing protocol. Reports indicate that those allowed to see these tapes must sign non-disclosure agreements and sometimes undergo spiritual direction afterward. Some clergy who have viewed the materials report insomnia, nightmares, and heightened anxiety. One priest, interviewed anonymously, said he was required to fast and pray for 3 days before and after viewing a single tape. The Vatican's concern appears to center on contagion, not physical, but interpretive. A tape viewed out of context, or by those without theological training, might lead to confusion, panic, or worse, belief in practices the Church does not endorse. Some cases reportedly involve rites that deviate from official liturgy, using prayers or symbols drawn from forbidden texts. There are also legal implications. If a subject were to die during a recorded rite, the footage could be considered evidence in civil investigations. In at least one instance, such a video was reportedly confiscated by local police before the Church could retrieve it. The case was dismissed. The tape was never returned. In the modern era, when recording devices are ubiquitous, the Church has become more cautious. Official policy discourages filming. In most dioceses, permission must be granted in writing, and the equipment is owned and operated by clergy. No outside observers are allowed. Yet despite the restrictions, the desire to document persists, driven not by curiosity, but by the need to understand what the written word cannot capture. And still, the recordings remain unseen, locked in drawers, buried in private safes, known only by whispered references. What these videos contain may never be known publicly, but for those who have seen them, the experience is not forgotten. They speak of silence that isn't empty, of movement that defies joints, of voices that should not speak, and of the overwhelming sense not of terror but of interruption, something foreign, something observing. Possession in the modern Church. The growing number of unacknowledged cases. While the Vatican's official stance on demonic possession remains cautious and restrained, requests for exorcisms have steadily increased over the past 2 decades. Across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia, priests report a quiet resurgence, people arriving at parish doors, not for confession or catechism, but for deliverance. They speak of shadows that follow, voices that whisper, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. And yet, many of these cases never reach the Church's central authority. They are documented locally, if at all, and dealt with in silence. In 2018, a report by the International Association of Exorcists, a Vatican-sanctioned but independently operated body, noted a dramatic rise in global exorcism requests. Italy alone reported an estimated 500,000 inquiries that year. In the Philippines, similar numbers were observed, though much of the activity occurred outside diocesan control. In France, the Archdiocese of Paris doubled its number of trained exorcists between 2012 and 2020. In the United States, several dioceses that once had no appointed exorcist were forced to reinstate the role after clergy became overwhelmed. And yet, despite this increase, the Vatican's public communication on the matter has remained nearly unchanged since the 1999 revision of the Ritual Romanum. The revised rite emphasized caution, theological discipline, and deference to psychiatric evaluation. But it made no mention of how to handle an institutional response when the number of cases outpaces the Church's capacity to address them. Priests on the ground speak of waiting lists. In Poland, some claim to have backlogs stretching over a year. In Mexico, priests conduct preliminary interviews in public parks due to a lack of secure meeting spaces. In Nigeria, entire villages turn to a single priest trained decades ago, passing on stories of successful exorcisms that border on legend. These accounts do not often appear in formal church documents, but they circulate in sermons, whispered among clergy, and shared cautiously at retreats. One American priest, who asked not to be named, described a case in 2021 involving a teenage girl who had begun to speak backwards in full sentences. Her family first consulted doctors. When no neurological or psychiatric explanation emerged, they turned to their local parish. The priest contacted his diocese, only to be told there were no active exorcists available. After 2 weeks of delay, he received a digital copy of the rite and performed it alone. He reported a partial improvement, but no official file was opened. He later learned that a similar case had occurred in a nearby parish 3 months prior. In Ireland, Father Malachi M., a semi-retired cleric, claimed in 2019 that more than 60 people had come to him over a span of 6 months. Most he turned away. Some he prayed over. A few, he performed minor rites of deliverance. When he requested formal authorization from his bishop to conduct a full exorcism, he received no reply. "They would rather I didn't ask," he said. The reluctance, many believe, is not theological. It is bureaucratic. The Vatican recognizes possession as a real, albeit rare, phenomenon. But acknowledging the scale of current reports would require a public shift in tone, one that might invite ridicule, controversy, or a flood of further requests. It would also require resources, trained exorcists, support teams, medical advisors, and administrators. Few dioceses are prepared to make such investments. Meanwhile, Catholic lay movements have stepped into the void. In Brazil and parts of Africa, charismatic groups perform what they call liberation ministries. These often include improvised rituals, prayer circles, and speaking in tongues. Though loosely based on Catholic teachings, they are not sanctioned by church authorities. Still, they persist, filling a space that the institutional church appears unwilling to occupy. The Vatican has issued general warnings against these movements, but rarely intervenes directly. Even among officially trained exorcists, concerns have been raised. In 2020, Father Francesco B., an experienced exorcist in southern Italy, stated during a closed conference that many modern possessions no longer follow the patterns described in classical theology. He cited cases involving electronic interference, inexplicable data loss, and distorted digital recordings. He was not speaking metaphorically. He claimed that audio files of certain sessions would corrupt, even when backed up multiple times. His statements were not included in the conference's final report. And yet, the Church proceeds with caution. At most, it acknowledges a pastoral need for increased discernment, but the files are rarely opened. The names are rarely documented. Cases are resolved quietly, if at all. In Chicago, a 2022 case involving a middle-aged man who reportedly underwent 4 exorcism sessions has never been acknowledged by the Archdiocese. A staff member at the church where the rites were held confirmed that something had taken place, but said no paperwork was filed. The man himself left the city afterward. His family declined to speak. What this creates is a growing rift between reality and recognition. On one side, the faithful report encounters that they cannot explain, symptoms that defy both medicine and psychology. On the other, a church that continues to treat possession as theoretical and rare, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The Vatican is aware reports are filed, letters sent, but little changes. As older priests retire and younger ones are trained in liturgy, not exorcism, knowledge of the rites fades. What remains is fragmented and unofficial. The afflicted seek only relief, unaware of these gaps. But for the Church, the deeper concern is this: how long can it suppress rising cases, without losing control of what it once claimed to contain? The forbidden texts, grimoires, manuals, and the Church's most dangerous books. Inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, there are shelves that contain volumes not listed in public catalogs. These books are rarely mentioned, even among Church scholars. They are classified under restricted access and often coded by handwritten identifiers. Some are bound in worn leather, others wrapped in linen cloth. They are not decorative. They are not symbolic. These are manuals, grimoires, exorcistic texts, and ritual instructions that predate the formal rites of the Church. They are kept not for reverence, but for containment. One such volume, referenced only in internal memos, is known as Orationes Obscurae. It is believed to have originated in the late 4th century, possibly from a desert hermitage in Syria. The book contains alternating prayers in Latin and Syriac, invoking saints whose names no longer appear in any liturgical record. One entry describes a rite to silence the wandering spirit by reciting specific psalms backward, a practice strictly forbidden in Church protocol. The book was reportedly recovered from a monastic library in Antioch and brought to Rome during the Crusades. Another volume, sometimes called Liber Tenebrarum, was discovered in a Jesuit archive in Spain during a property audit in 1897. Bound in dark goat leather and written in a blend of ecclesiastical Latin and medieval Catalan, the text includes invocations not found in the Ritual Romanum. Marginal notes suggest it was used by field missionaries during the Reconquista. One section references the 3 questions of the unclean spirit, a verbal formula said to compel a possessing entity to name its origin, purpose, and intended target. The formula is not recognized in any modern rite. The Church does not include these texts in seminary and training. They are not referenced in catechism. Their use is explicitly prohibited, and yet they are not destroyed. They are preserved, categorized, and kept under watch. The reason, according to restricted memoranda, is that the knowledge they contain may be efficacious but theologically incompatible. In other words, they work, but they are not safe. In the 17th century, an internal investigation known as the Congregatio de Libris Prohibitis examined over a dozen such texts stored in the Vatican. Their conclusion was not to eliminate them, but to restrict them. The books were moved into locked cabinets, access granted only to high-ranking clergy with written authorization. Many had to sign oaths not to copy or quote any passage. Violations resulted in immediate reassignment. Some texts are not handwritten at all. In 1973, during renovations of a seminary in northern Italy, a hollow wall revealed a collection of lithographed booklets. The documents were printed between 1870 and 1905, likely distributed among a discreet network of exorcists. One booklet, titled simply Manuductio ad Exorcismum, included instructions on detecting deception during possession, invoking angelic names not listed in Scripture, and using relics in combination with spoken prayer. It was marked ad usum privatum tantum, for private use only. Even more controversial are texts that borrow from non-Christian traditions. A fragment known as Tractatus de Spiritibus Orientis includes passages adapted from Coptic and early Jewish magical texts. It describes rites that involve the use of sealed vessels, red ochre symbols, and the burial of prayer scrolls beneath the afflicted's home. The Vatican has never confirmed the text's existence, but notes referencing it appear in an archival ledger from 1924, listing it under the category Traditio non publicanda. There is also evidence that the Church has, on occasion, consulted these forbidden books when ordinary rites failed. In a 1958 letter preserved in the private correspondence of Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, a request is made for a copy of the relevant verses from the Spanish volume associated with the Pyrenees incidents. No context is given. The Pyrenees incidents are not publicly documented. But the implication is clear. A case arose in which the standard liturgy proved insufficient. Priests who have reportedly seen these texts describe them in cautious terms. One Italian cleric, speaking anonymously in 2001, said that the power of the books lay not just in their content, but in their specificity. The modern rite is like a general map, he said. These are like blueprints, exact, detailed, and dangerous when misread. Not all forbidden texts are ancient. Some were written in the 19th and 20th centuries by exorcists who adapted church practice to confront emerging cases. One such document, known unofficially as the Naples Codex, is said to contain instructions for dealing with afflictions involving multiple entities, or what some exorcists refer to as layered possession. The Church does not recognize this classification, but the document remains under lock and key. The Vatican's reluctance to destroy these texts stems from a paradox. While they conflict with official doctrine, they may offer tools for confronting cases the modern Church cannot fully address. But using them would mean admitting their validity, and that would open questions the Church is not prepared to answer. What does it mean if the forbidden rites work? If prayers outside canon produce results? Where does authority lie in theology or in efficacy? And if the Church once relied on these books, but now denies them, what else has been quietly rewritten? In keeping these volumes hidden, the Church walks a careful line. It does not suppress knowledge, it contains it. It does not deny the past, it withholds it. And as more cases arise, more voices, more afflictions, more unexplained phenomena, the weight of these books does not diminish. It grows heavier. The Vatican's war on memory. Why these files may never be opened. Deep inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, there are rooms whose contents are not listed in any public inventory. Even within the Church, only a small group of individuals know what lies behind certain locked doors. Among those rooms are cabinets, marked with sparse Latin phrases, De Obsessiis, Privata Rituum, Testimonia non lecta. These labels are not just identifiers, they are warnings. What is stored inside are the records the Church has chosen not to erase but never intends to reveal. In theory, the Vatican Archive is accessible to scholars. In 2019, Pope Francis extended the archive's available materials up to the pontificate of Pius XII. But accessibility does not mean transparency. Thousands of documents remain classified, inaccessible, under the justification of pastoral sensitivity, diplomatic risk, or institutional discretion. Among these sealed files are the first-hand reports of exorcisms conducted under direct Vatican oversight, reports written by clergy who never spoke of them again. In 1976, an internal directive issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith stated that all documentation relating to spiritual anomalies involving violent resistance to sacred elements was to be classified under subsecreto pontificio, the highest level of confidentiality within church governance. This status places the material above the authority of diocesan bishops. Only the Pope, or a representative with explicit papal mandate, can authorize access. These are not theological discussions. They are case files. Many contain handwritten witness statements, physical evidence logs, and audio transcripts. Some include photographs. Others, references to missing media recordings, tapes, or ritual objects that were collected and stored off-site. The details of what happened to those materials are redacted or omitted entirely. In the 1982nd, several church archivists raised concerns over the long-term effects of burying such material. An internal memo from that period, authored by a priest-librarian in the Lateran complex, questioned whether the suppression of extraordinary evidence creates doctrinal fragility rather than stability. The memo was never formally answered. The priest was later reassigned to a theological library in Malta. The logic behind the concealment is partly rooted in fear not just of scandal, but of destabilizing belief. If the public were shown compelling evidence of phenomena that defy science, psychology, and standard theology, the Church could no longer shape the narrative. It would lose control of how the faithful understand evil, and worse, how they understand the Church's ability, or inability, to contain it. There is also the matter of contradiction. Some of the reports stored in the archive contain descriptions of rites that were never approved, prayers spoken in languages no longer used in liturgy, objects deployed that resemble practices the Church condemns, amulets, burning herbs, incantations adapted from pre-Christian texts. To acknowledge these cases publicly would be to admit that the Church has, at times, acted outside its own authority to combat something it does not fully comprehend. Yet, the files are kept. They are not destroyed. They remain in controlled humidity, bound in archival paper, labeled by hand, and stored with precision. This choice reflects an uncomfortable truth that the Church knows these documents may one day be necessary, not for publicity, not for conversion, but for survival. Whispers within church circles describe a classified catalog known as Index Praesidiae, a list of the most volatile cases ever recorded. The existence of this index has never been confirmed, but references to it appear in private correspondences between senior clergy during the 1992nd. The index is rumored to include instructions on containment rather than healing cases where exorcism failed and the afflicted were isolated, moved, or left under indefinite observation. The idea of possession that never ends contradicts the Church's official understanding of liberation through Christ. And yet, several entries in parish records across Europe note long-term spiritual observation, decades after the initial rite. Some of the individuals never reintegrated into society. Others were institutionalized under different pretexts. None were listed as cured. Why then does the Vatican maintain silence? The answer may lie in a concept rarely discussed publicly: spiritual contagion. A theory exists within private theological circles that exposure to certain cases, not just physical proximity, but knowledge itself, can provoke psychological or spiritual harm. According to this line of thought, reading the files could be dangerous, not because they are dramatic, but because they undermine the boundaries between belief and reality. The Church has always understood the power of stories. It has shaped centuries of faith through scripture, homily, and ritual. But the exorcism files do not behave like scripture. They cannot be preached from the pulpit. They contain contradictions, anomalies, and moments of failure. They reveal not just evil, but uncertainty. And uncertainty, within a system based on absolute truth, is corrosive. In 2015, a Vatican archivist assigned to an unrelated diplomatic cataloging task encountered a mislabeled box. Inside were fragments of a file involving a 1962 exorcism performed in Eastern Europe. The priest who had written the report described voices speaking in multiple registers, simultaneous with one another. He included a diagram of the afflicted spinal posture during trance, a shape not physically possible. The final page ended with a phrase in Latin: "Non exorcisare potest, sed tantum coercere." It cannot be exorcised, only restrained. The archivist was instructed to reseal the box and never mention it again. These files may never be opened, not because they are forgotten, but because memory itself has been weaponized. To forget is not always accidental. Sometimes it is administrative. The war is not just against demons, it is against acknowledgement, against the moment when the curtain is pulled back and the public sees what the Church has always carried and always feared to explain. If this story left you with questions or chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There's more hidden history, forbidden knowledge, and untold truths waiting to be uncovered. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And remember, some secrets were never meant to stay buried.